Baldur's Gate 2 should be a fairly influential game for me because it's the first full game where I was a lead. And so as a result, it should be very foundational. But I think what's sort of happened in my brain is that a lot of the lessons from this game in my mind have become lessons of Jade Empire or lessons of Baldur's Gate 1. And so as a result, things have been lost into the annals of history to a certain degree. This is the first game where I show up relatively early in the credits. We hadn't moved yet to the single panel style credits for the core leads, but I still show up relatively soon in this flow.
Baldur's Gate 2 Shadows of Amn, as well as its expansion pack, Baldur's Gate 2 Throne of Bhaal. So Baldur's Gate 2 was the first full game where I was in a leadership position from the very beginning. This is the direct sequel to Baldur's Gate 1 and Tales of the Sword Coast, and it picks up the story from that point. It is really, truly a sequel. Most of the games that BioWare has made over the years aren't true sequels. I mean that 95+% of the code base in Baldur's Gate 2 is in common with Baldur's Gate 1. There are obviously improvements made. We improved and increased the walking speed. We added higher resolution support because the hardware had moved along. We changed the way that the discs were laid out so that there wasn't so much duplication. But it's a true sequel, and it really benefits from that. This has been called a game built of gum and twine by people who really understood how that gum and twine really worked. And I think that's a very apt way to put it. I think that that is an important lesson that honestly maybe BioWare hasn't fully taken advantage of. When you make a sequel that is truly building upon what came before it, there are opportunities there that present themselves. You have a team that understands what they're working with and understands how to get the best out of what they're working with. And that's exactly what happened with Baldur's Gate 2. We were able to springboard off a game system that we understood the strengths, we understood the weaknesses, and really get an amazing amount of benefit out of that fact. When you look at other games, we have had sequels, and we've had sequels that have taken advantage of what came before them. But I don't think anything that BioWare has ever done has come to the same level of synchronicity that Baldur's Gate 2 did. And I think that's an interesting lesson and something that maybe is beneficial to people going forward. Baldur's Gate 2 came out in the year 2000, and the year 2000 is an interesting one because that's also the year that the 3rd edition D&D rule system came out. And Wizards of the Coast wanted us to switch to 3rd edition for Baldur's Gate 2, which, as I just said, being a pure sequel was frankly the height of lunacy. So we said no correctly. But we did also make some compromise. We added the sorcerer and we added the monk, both of them being things that were classes that were in the core part of 3rd edition D&D. Monk came in and out of 2nd edition D&D. The sorcerer was something new added specifically into 3rd edition. And I think that there's a lesson kind of lurking in the fringes of that anecdote, because I think it was critically important that we drew a line with Wizards of the Coast and said, no, we're not switching this game from 2nd edition to 3rd edition. That's an impossibility. But we are willing to compromise. We are willing to make some gestures to what you're looking for and at least provide some support for what you're trying to do. So maybe that's really 2 lessons. The first being that when you hit a line that you can't cross, not cross it. That line in the sand is there for a reason, and you need to understand that you can't just back up forever. That being said, it is also useful to look for opportunities to work with your partners, to find places where you can have common ground and you can build a foundation to move forward. I guess to pile the lessons on here, one thing to be careful about is you can't draw a line in the sand everywhere. Know where you can compromise, know where you can move, know where you can allow the other party to win. Because if you can, then when you need to draw that line, it's all the more powerful. I was definitely a working lead on Baldur's Gate 2, a working lead being a lead who is also working as an individual contributor in their discipline. I really like the idea of working leads. It keeps people honest. It keeps you grounded in what you're doing. Obviously, it can interfere with your ability to do the leadership duties. I don't know that I was the best manager on Baldur's Gate 2. I didn't provide the best in terms of career growth and mentorship. That being said, I think it actually maybe made me a better leader, if not a better manager. It allowed me to understand better what was going on in the game, in the tech base, and I think that let me be more effective in terms of leading the technical effort on that game. I haven't been a working lead in a long time, not since Sonic the Dark Brotherhood, so it is certainly possible, plausible, maybe even probable that I have romanticized the working leadership role, but I do think there is power in having someone who is making decisions, who is in a leadership position, being someone who also is executing on their craft. Perhaps there is some way to divorce leadership and management to allow that person to have as much bandwidth as possible. Some really interesting things that we did from a gameplay perspective in Baldur's Gate 2. As I said, we added the sorcerer. Sorcerer, different than a wizard or different than cleric, in that you could cast any spell you knew, and you had a fixed number of spell slots. That's actually kind of the way that in 5th edition all the spellcasters work, but that was pretty revolutionary at the time of 3rd edition, so that required some UI changes. I actually snuck in a subclass that I really like into the wizard, which is the wild mage. That's a mage where every time they cast a spell, there's a chance that something goes terribly, terribly wrong, or possibly terribly, terribly right. It's also when we implemented time stop, and I'm the person who implemented time stop, and I think time stop's an interesting example of what you can do when you have a code base that's relatively controlled. The total number of lines of code in the Baldur's Gate engines, in the Infinity engine, is a couple 100,000. Compare that to engines like Frostbite or Unreal, where the number of lines of code get into the millions. What that meant is that I pretty much understood where the update loop went and what needed to handle time stop. And time stop's done in a pretty brute force way. Every single update loop simply checked to see if time stop was going on, and then it checked to see if you were the person who cast time stop. And if you weren't, then it just skipped your update loop. And then when the time stop ended, the update loop just picked off from where it left off. All the effects didn't tick, so they didn't expire. Everything just froze in place, and it works perfectly as a result. In Baldur's Gate 2, the time stop also applies a screen effect, which makes everything black and white. We actually went to a sepia tone in Throne of Ball, which I actually like the look of better. That's it. That's time stop. Is just goes in the update loop. It just checks, and if it needs to stop you, it just stops you and just skips the update loop and then picks up afterwards. I want to say that there's a lesson here about simpler code bases, or there's a lesson here about sometimes brute forcing your way through a problem. And there might be, but I do caution that because games have gotten a lot more complicated, engines have gotten a lot more complicated, you likely don't control your entire tech base. So some of the ways that things were done in Baldur's Gate may not be really practical or replicable in a modern engine. I would say that probably you shouldn't be always afraid of brute forcing your way through a problem, especially now with the amount of CPU and memory that's available often to be thrown at a problem set. But I do recognize that today is not the late 90s, and you're dealing with problem sets that are much more complicated than we were. So I think there are two things that are interesting things that happen in the year 2000 that are worth talking about, because I think together they go to a lesson that maybe I didn't learn during Baldur's Gate 2, but I learned afterwards. In the year 2000, the game Sims shipped from Electronic Arts, and I remember at the time being completely perplexed how this was even a game. I certainly loved SimCity and other Sim-style games in the past, but Sims just didn't seem like it was possibly a game. It's like, this is Sim Your Life, and I dismissed that game out of hand. And as hopefully everyone listening knows, that's gone on to become one of the most successful franchises in all of gaming history. The other interesting thing that happened in the year 2000 is that Valve actually came to BioWare to pitch this thing they were working on that would be a place where you would go to buy games and then you would download them. And at the time, they were pitching something where you would be able to start playing them when only part of the game was downloaded. We walked away from that. We said no to that. And I remember thinking that, yeah, this is never going to catch on. For those of you who can't connect the dots, that is Steam. Valve actually came to BioWare before Steam had launched and wanted to partner with us to work on that. I don't know how the world would look differently if we had gone ahead with that partnership. It is interesting to think about. The lesson that is worth conveying from both of those experiences is that just because you think something isn't going to work, just because it's not interesting to you, doesn't mean it's actually a stupid idea. You can be wrong. Your biases, your experiences, your understanding shape your views. You need to be aware of that fact, because that blindness can lead you to not do things that could be successful. I like to think I've learned that lesson. I hope I have, because I do think that being open to ideas that you don't get is something that allows innovation and allows games or anything to be great. So Throne of Bhaal was the expansion pack for Baldur's Gate 2. Unlike the expansion pack for Baldur's Gate 1, it takes place after the events of Baldur's Gate 2. It is the actual culmination and completion of the Baldur's Gate story, where it all wraps up and all comes to a conclusion. As I mentioned in the previous video, there are disadvantages to that style of expansion pack, because if you haven't finished the main story, then there's very little reason for you to want to play the expansion pack. That being said, it also allowed the story to be much more impactful and to actually go somewhere and come to a conclusion for the entire series. Something that Throne of Bhaal does, which I think is really good and really important to do, is there is a moment where you get to fight wave after wave of much lower level monster, things that you've encountered earlier in the series. And the reason why that's so cool is it's just a moment the player at the height of their power to feel awesome, to get that moment to understand truly how far they've come and to just let loose. And I think that's something that is great to give players an opportunity to do. As Throne of Bhaal was wrapping up, a small team actually explored something that was called Five Fingers of Death. It was a kung fu game that was built using the Infinity Engine, pretty campy. Ultimately, that game would go on to become Jade Empire, not using the technology base, but just the concept of a kung fu based game would then later become Jade Empire. I do think that looking back from the present at the Baldur's Gate series, where we did 2 main games and 2 expansion packs, I think it fit the business model of the time to a large degree, but I actually wonder if there wasn't an opportunity for something shaped slightly differently. There's certainly enough content across those 4 titles to at least have made 4 full $60 products, or maybe even more. And I do wonder, looking at the business landscape in AAA these days, if we aren't going to see more of that. More tighter games released more quickly with less live service and less support given after launch. I think when you look at the Assassin's Creeds, they've definitely delivered on a very high, fast cadence. And I think that there may be something to that. Leaning into true sequels, leaning into self-contained games. Single-player games remain strong, and there's an opportunity for maybe a return to something that looks a little bit more like gaming looked like back when you couldn't sell DLC, that it had to come on a disc and go in a box. Baldur's Gate 2 still gets on lists of the best PC games of all time, and I think that's a testament to the scope and ambition of that game, but also a testament to the fact that it was a sequel, the fact that it was built by people who knew the game they were building, knew what they were trying to do, knew the tools they were using, and knew how to put everything together effectively. Baldur's Gate is very foundational to who I am and who I became as a game developer. Baldur's Gate 2 is where I became comfortable with a lead programmer position. Everything's kind of mushed up in my brain a little bit, so maybe my memories aren't quite as clear on this one as they are on Baldur's Gate 1, even though it's more recently. Hopefully you found some use out of this.
A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you found this video interesting, give it a thumbs up because that tells YouTube that it's worth spreading to more people. We have merch now. There should be a shelf below this video if you're interested in picking up some merchandise. That helps out the channel as well. Are you interested in seeing me stream Baldur's Gate 1 and Baldur's Gate 2 after we're done with the Dragon Age series? Let me know that down in the comments. What are your memories of this franchise? Have you even ever played it? For some of you, this game came out before you were born. Let me know that down in the comments as well. I will see you again soon. Thank you.